I was in a 2-day evidentiary hearing and I accepted the judge's rulings.
BJ Penn finds himself back in legal trouble, facing what could be the most serious consequences of his ongoing legal battles. For those who've tracked his recent history, this development might not come as a complete surprise. His past several months have been marked by multiple arrests spanning family disputes to assault charges, but this current situation carries a different weight. Everything appears to be converging toward a potentially permanent resolution. What exactly transpired? Let's examine the details. The courtroom became the stage where his legal fate began to crystallize. On March 2, 2026, BJ Penn stood before the High-Low Circuit Court for proceedings connected to several misdemeanor allegations, including domestic abuse and violations of protective orders. However, the entire case had stalled on one critical matter that now dominated the proceedings: a psychological evaluation. From the hearing's opening moments, complications were evident. Rather than proceeding with the assessment, his defense team mounted a challenge. Penn's lawyers submitted a formal request asking the court to reconsider or suspend the state-mandated psychological examination, contending that a previous voluntary assessment had already established his mental fitness. Superficially, this argument appears logical. If an individual has undergone evaluation and been deemed mentally competent, why duplicate the process? The prosecution viewed it differently. They contended the earlier assessment was inadequate, lacking thoroughness, and relying excessively on Penn's personal statements without independent corroboration. This distinction between self-reported information and independently verified findings became the crucial factor in the entire hearing. From the court's viewpoint, this wasn't merely administrative procedure. It concerned establishing certainty, and certainty demands more than telephone consultations or self-described evaluations. The judge considered both positions carefully before rendering a decision that would shape all subsequent proceedings. He rejected the motion. Judge Peter Kubota dismissed the request to halt the evaluation and mandated that Penn complete the state-required psychological examination. That directive alone would have advanced the case, but the judge's additional statement gave this moment particular significance. Rather than simply restating the order, he issued a direct warning. He cautioned that continued refusal or postponement of the evaluation would prompt the court to pursue contempt charges, potentially resulting in incarceration. This transformed the entire dynamic, shifting the focus from mere compliance to immediate, tangible consequences that wouldn't await trial commencement. What makes this moment especially illuminating is Penn's response, not merely his actions, but his tone, language, and how he characterizes what's occurring. For him, this evaluation wasn't simply procedural requirement, it represented something fundamentally different. He resisted the notion of its necessity, questioned its rationale, and critically questioned its ramifications. In his view, this wasn't about legal process, it concerned reputation, earnings, and identity. He maintained that the psychological evaluation could harm his public standing and diminish his capacity to generate income through appearances connected to his reputation. This reveals the disconnect more clearly. While the court focuses on competency, whether he comprehends the proceedings and can participate in his defense, Penn concentrates on different concerns, on appearances and implications for his identity beyond the courtroom. These priorities don't align or even intersect.
2 weeks before you made the decision for me to do a mental health exam. I was in a 2-day evidentiary hearing.
This moment reveals something nuanced, yet significant. It's not mere disagreement, but confusion about the situation's escalation. From his viewpoint, he had already engaged in proceedings and followed previous court orders. So why was his mental state suddenly questioned? The answer, though not explicitly stated then, had been developing for months. This March hearing didn't occur independently. It resulted from everything preceding it: missed evaluations, repeated violations, escalating assertions. In December 2025, Penn was scheduled for his first court-mandated psychological evaluation. He failed to appear. His absence from the initial mental health examination scheduled for late December 2025 contributed to case delays. When he returned to court in January 2026, he didn't simply acknowledge the missed appointment and continue. He contested it.
Former UFC superstar BJ Penn claims he was never told about his appointment for a court-ordered mental exam.
Penn claimed the failure to appear wasn't his responsibility. He blamed his attorney, asserting he had never received proper notification of the appointment. He maintained that he hadn't been informed of the evaluation date and only discovered it indirectly through court documents reviewed by someone else. This assertion introduced another layer of courtroom tension. Now the issue encompassed not just the evaluation, but representation, communication, and trust. He submitted motions to replace his attorney, remove the judge, and challenge the case's entire framework. Combining all these elements, the missed evaluation, blaming counsel, attempting to remove both attorney and judge, reveals a pattern extending beyond simple legal strategy. It resembles resistance to the entire process. This resistance is precisely what the court seeks to evaluate. From a legal perspective, repeated non-compliance raises an essential question. Is the defendant refusing cooperation or unable to cooperate? This question sits at everything's center. If the answer is refusal, the court can implement penalties. However, if the answer is inability, if genuine concerns about mental fitness exist, then the court must pause, assess, and ensure the person facing trial actually comprehends what's happening. That's why the evaluation isn't optional, but foundational. That's why Judge Kubota's warning carries such weight, signaling the court's unwillingness to continue negotiating on this point. The evaluation will occur, regardless of circumstances. If it doesn't, consequences won't wait for trial to begin, but start immediately. This makes the March 2026 hearing so significant. It's not another timeline date, but the moment the case stops drifting and begins focusing, where the court establishes boundaries and options become clear: comply or face contempt, proceed or be compelled. What intensifies the situation further is everything occurring outside the courtroom simultaneously. While legal proceedings unfold, the narrative surrounding Penn continues expanding: claims about imposters, public statements, a version of reality misaligned with courtroom presentations. He has consistently claimed family members, including his mother, have been replaced by imposters attempting to control family assets. This belief isn't background noise, but central. If this is his operational framework, then every legal order, restriction, and accusation gets interpreted through that lens, making compliance not just difficult, but potentially impossible, because you cannot agree with a system built on a reality you don't accept. This represents the tension defining this entire case, not just events, but their interpretation. As the hearing concludes, there's no resolution, no final determination of guilt or innocence, just a directive: complete the evaluation, return to court. He was ordered to undergo the mental health examination and return to court on May 13, 2026, with results. That date, May 13, becomes the next focal point. Everything now depends on what occurs between these moments: whether he complies, whether the evaluation is completed, whether results confirm or challenge the court's suspicions. As of that March hearing, one thing is clear: the case no longer concerns just his actions. It's about whether he understands what's happening to him. Until that question gets answered, nothing else advances. Not the charges, trial, or outcome, just waiting and growing pressure of what happens if the court's established line gets crossed again. From champion to pattern, the arrests that continued escalating. Before court warnings, motions, and the slow collision between resistance and consequence, a pattern was already forming. To understand why the court eventually drew a hard line, you must step back and examine who BJ Penn was and what he had become in the years leading to 2026. This isn't just about a man appearing in court, it's about a legendary figure whose identity was built on dominance, discipline, and control, slowly becoming associated with something far less stable, predictable, and more concerning. BJ Penn wasn't just another fighter passing through the UFC. He was, at one time, the embodiment of raw, almost supernatural talent, earning the nickname the Prodigy, because he achieved things faster than anyone thought possible. He became the first non-Brazilian to win the IBJJF World Championship at black belt level and went on to become a two-division UFC champion, winning titles in both lightweight and welterweight divisions. In an era when moving between weight classes was rare and often unsuccessful, Penn didn't just attempt it, he made it appear effortless. His legacy wasn't built on publicity, but on moments, victories, and a reputation that made his name carry significance far beyond the cage. Yet by 2025's arrival, that same name began appearing in headlines for reasons unrelated to fighting. This shift didn't happen suddenly, but unfolded through a sequence of events that quickly stopped resembling coincidence and started forming an unbreakable pattern.
UFC Hall of Famer BJ Penn was back in court today in Hilo. Penn was arrested twice over the Memorial Day weekend, accused of assaulting his 79-year-old mother.
What commenced in May 2025 initially appeared to be a domestic dispute, the type of situation that, while serious, still fits familiar categories. However, that first arrest details immediately suggested something more complex was developing beneath the surface. On May 25, 2025, Penn was arrested for abuse of a family or household member following an alleged confrontation with his mother, with specifics including claims he had taken mail from her mailbox, shined a bright flashlight into her eyes when confronted, and physically grabbed and pushed her. This created an image already difficult to reconcile with the composed, disciplined champion people remembered. Yet more revealing than the incident itself was what followed. Because before there was time for de-escalation, before meaningful separation could be established between him and the triggering environment, the pattern began repeating almost immediately. On May 26, 2025, he was arrested again for violating a stay-away order issued after the initial incident, and that rapid return transforms the narrative from a single event into something cyclical. A stay-away order is designed to create distance, both physically and legally. In this case, that distance never materialized. Instead, the system found itself responding to the same situation twice within 24 hours. This is where the story begins shifting. Repetition at that speed suggests whatever drives the behavior isn't being interrupted by consequences in the normal way. This observation becomes more significant when the pattern continues expanding beyond those first two arrests.
Prosecutors say he violated the temporary restraining order against him by coming within 100 yards of their home.
Within days, the situation extended into the legal process itself. Around May 30th, 2025, Penn was arrested for a third time after failing to appear in court, resulting in a bench warrant. And this moment is critical because it demonstrates the pattern is no longer confined to interpersonal conflict. It now includes disengagement from the system, attempting to resolve that conflict. Missing a court date in isolation might be explainable, but within the context of consecutive arrests and escalating legal pressure, it becomes part of a larger sequence suggesting something more fundamental isn't aligning. The cycle persisted into June. On June 12, 2025, he was arrested again for violating the temporary restraining order, and by this point, the pattern structure is firmly established. A boundary gets set, that boundary gets crossed, and the consequence leads not to adjustment, but to repetition. The court, recognizing this, escalated its response by formalizing those boundaries into something more permanent. In August 2025, a one-year protection order was granted, prohibiting contact with his mother and restricting property access, and this was intended to stabilize the situation by introducing long-term consequences for further violations. However, even that didn't end the pattern. By September, identical behavior resurfaced once more. On September 15, 2025, Penn was arrested for the fifth time after entering his mother's property in violation of the active protection order. At this stage, the repetition becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence or temporary instability. The same location, same restriction, and same outcome all indicate a loop that legal intervention alone isn't breaking. Then, at some point, the situation stops being contained within reports, filings, and courtroom summaries and spills into something raw, unfiltered, something that shows how this behavior appears when it's no longer being interpreted, but simply captured.
I don't give a what you 30 grams. I get off only two. You're not the only holy here. We don't need goods. We don't need goods, you fucking dummy.
That moment matters, not because of the words alone, but because of what it represents. It's no longer structured, no longer filtered through legal language or courtroom procedure. It's direct, emotional, chaotic, and it reveals a side of the situation that paperwork only hints at. When placed alongside the arrests, violations, and repeated returns to restricted spaces, it stops appearing like isolated incidents and starts resembling a continuous state of escalation that doesn't fully reset between encounters. What complicates this pattern further is that it doesn't remain confined to the family dispute, because in November, the situation expands outward entirely. On November 4, 2025, Penn was arrested for third-degree assault after allegedly punching and kicking a 45-year-old man in high-low, introducing a separate incident not directly tied to his mother or the restraining order. Yet, when viewed alongside previous arrests, it doesn't feel disconnected. It feels like an extension of the same instability, manifesting in a different environment, under different circumstances, but following the same underlying trajectory. By 2025's end, the accumulation of these incidents forms a timeline that's difficult to ignore. He had been arrested at least 6 times within the year, facing multiple misdemeanor charges, including domestic abuse, restraining order violations, and assault, and those numbers, while significant, only tell part of the story. Running parallel to these arrests, informing them, shaping them, and perhaps even driving them is a belief that appears consistently across both court filings and public statements.
He has this thought in his mind that someone kidnapped and replaced his family and is coming after.
He repeatedly claimed that his family members, including his mother, had been replaced by imposters attempting to take control of family assets, and that belief isn't a minor detail. It's the lens through which the entire pattern must be understood. Because if someone genuinely believes the people around them aren't who they claim to be, then actions that appear irrational from the outside begin following a different kind of internal logic. Returning to a house you're legally barred from may not feel like a violation if you don't accept the legitimacy of the person enforcing that boundary, and confronting someone identified as family may not feel like conflict if you believe that identity itself is false. That's what makes the situation so difficult for the legal system to resolve, because the system is built on shared reality, on the assumption that all parties involved agree at a basic level on what's happening. In this case, that agreement doesn't fully exist, and without it, every intervention becomes less effective. Arrests don't interrupt the pattern as they normally would. Restraining orders don't create the intended distance, and court appearances don't produce the compliance that would allow the case to move forward cleanly. Instead, everything loops back into the same structure: violation, arrest, release, and return. As that loop continues, the case's focus begins shifting away from individual incidents towards something more fundamental, not just what happened, but why it keeps happening. When behavior repeats this consistently, despite escalating consequences, the legal system reaches a point where it can no longer treat each incident as separate, and instead has to step back and ask a broader question that reframes the entire situation, not how to punish the pattern, but how to understand it. And once that shift occurs, the next step becomes inevitable. He was ordered to undergo a mental health evaluation to determine whether he was fit to stand trial and able to understand the proceedings, but as a direct response to everything that came before it: the arrests, violations, consistency of claims, and the fact that none of it appears to be slowing down. At some point, the pattern itself becomes the evidence that something deeper needs examination, and once that happens, the case is no longer just about accountability. It becomes about comprehension.
Former UFC superstar BJ Penn claims he was never told about his appointment for a court-ordered mental exam.
By the time everything circles back to the courtroom, the story no longer concerns whether something happened. That question has been buried under months of arrests, violations, and repeated returns to the same conflict. Instead, the focus narrows into something far more specific, consequential, and uncomfortable to confront. Whether B.J. Penn is even capable of standing trial in the first place, and what happens if the answer to that question isn't as straightforward as the legal system needs it to be. After everything that unfolded throughout 2025, the repeated arrests, protection orders, expanding pattern of behavior, the case doesn't move forward into trial. It pauses completely, and it pauses for one reason alone: the mental health evaluation that now sits at everything's center. By late 2025, the court had ordered a mental health evaluation to determine Penn's fitness to stand trial and his ability to understand the proceedings against him. That decision isn't just procedural but foundational. Without that evaluation, nothing else can move forward. Not the charges, arguments, or outcome. It becomes the gatekeeper of the entire case. Yet, despite how critical it is, this is where the story becomes most unstable. Instead of compliance leading the process forward, the evaluation itself becomes the next point of resistance. It's delayed, missed, challenged, and ultimately turned into the case's central conflict. That moment, simple on the surface, captures the beginning of a breakdown that extends far beyond scheduling. When the evaluation is first missed in late 2025, it doesn't just delay the process. It introduces doubt into the case's surrounding structure. Communication between Penn and his attorney is called into question. Responsibility becomes unclear. Instead of the evaluation moving forward as planned, the case begins to stall in a way that feels less like a pause and more like a standstill. He stated that he hadn't been informed of the evaluation and blamed his attorney for the miscommunication. From that point forward, the situation no longer moves cleanly. What should have been a single step becomes multiple steps. Rescheduling, motions, arguments, attempts to halt the process entirely. By the time the case returns to court in early 2026, the evaluation is no longer just a requirement. It's the central point of contention. That statement reveals not just frustration, but a fundamental disconnect. From Penn's perspective, he had already participated in the process, already complied with prior proceedings, already demonstrated engagement with the system. So, the sudden shift toward questioning his mental fitness doesn't feel like natural progression. It feels like an escalation that he doesn't fully accept. From the court's perspective, that escalation is exactly what the pattern demands. The evaluation isn't based on a single moment, but on accumulation: the arrests, repeated violations, consistency of the belief that his family had been replaced by imposters. The court's concerns about Penn's mental state were tied to repeated claims that his family members were imposters, which had been cited in filings and public statements. That's what makes this moment so critical. The court isn't asking whether those beliefs are true, but whether those beliefs affect his ability to understand reality in a legal context. That distinction determines everything that comes next. When the case reaches the March 2nd, 2026 hearing, the situation is narrowed into a single issue: whether the evaluation will happen. The defense attempts one final shift. They argue that it doesn't need to. They claim that a prior voluntary mental health evaluation found no disorder and should replace the state-ordered exam. The prosecution rejects that argument immediately. According to them, the prior evaluation was incomplete, based largely on self-reporting, conducted without full context, and lacking the independent verification required for something as significant as determining fitness for trial. When the judge agrees, the motion is denied, the evaluation stands, and then comes the moment that reframes the entire situation, not as a delay, not as a disagreement, but as a turning point, a warning. Judge Kubota warned that if Penn refused to comply with the court-ordered evaluation, he could face contempt proceedings and possible jail time. That's the moment where everything shifts. Up until that point, the consequences had been tied to the past: arrests, charges, violations. But now the consequences are tied to the present, to compliance, to what happens next. And that's what makes this part of the story feel like a crossroads rather than a continuation. From here, the path splits. If the evaluation is completed and Penn is found fit to stand trial, the case moves forward in a familiar direction. Evidence is presented, charges are argued, outcomes are determined within the legal system structure. If the evaluation reaches a different conclusion, if he is found unfit, then the case stops again, but for a completely different reason. If Penn is deemed unfit to stand trial, he could be committed to a state facility such as Hawaii State Hospital until competency is restored. That possibility is what gives this entire situation its weight. For someone whose identity has been built on control, on being able to impose his will, dictate outcomes, and operate on his own terms, the idea of being removed from that control, even temporarily, represents something far more significant than any charge or sentence. It represents a loss of autonomy, and that's not something the legal system negotiates around. It enforces it. The hearing concludes with no resolution, no verdict, no sentence, just a directive. He was ordered to complete the mental health evaluation and return to court on May 13, 2026, with results. That date becomes the focal point of everything. It's no longer just another court appearance, but the moment where the system decides how to proceed. Not based on what happened in 2025, but based on what the evaluation reveals in 2026. This is where the title BJ Penn, Sentenced Goodbye Forever, takes on different meaning. As of now, there's no final sentence, no confirmed outcome. As of March 2026, the case remains unresolved, with all charges pending the mental health evaluation results, which means the goodbye in that title isn't necessarily about a prison sentence, it could be about something else entirely. The end of a public identity, the end of control, the end of the version of BJ Penn that people once recognized, because sometimes the most definitive endings don't come from a judge's ruling, they come from a shift in reality that cannot be reversed. As everything now points toward May 13th, the question is no longer whether the story will end, but how. Through trial, through treatment, or through something in between that leaves the outcome just as uncertain as the path that led there. Until that moment arrives, the case remains suspended, not resolved, not dismissed, but held in place by a single unanswered question. That answer determines everything, and without it, there's no ending, only waiting.